Hi everyone, welcome back to this week's content. This is the second video. I just wanted to change it up a little bit to make it a bit more fun, I guess more relatable. So that is why in this video we'll change the format, and rather than me taking you through some slides, I'll be talking in this modality and we'll be discussing specifically issues faced by beginning therapists. The thing is, because perhaps I'm not such a beginning therapist anymore because I have been working in the field for a couple of years now. But all these issues that I will be taking you through are still quite fresh in my mind. So that's my intention, take you through some of the issues faced by beginner therapists and how that relates to my own story, or perhaps give some examples of the things that happened to me and perhaps you could be facing as well if you're thinking about becoming a counselor at some point in your professional development. All right, so the first one I will like to talk about is this idea of dealing with our own feelings and anxieties. So what do we mean by dealing with our own feelings and anxieties? Well, basically, we're talking about feelings, our own, if I may borrow an expression from a psychoanalytic perspective, the Freudian perspective, we could say unresolved issues. So our own feelings coming to our conscious awareness stem from unresolved issues. And what I mean by that is, for example, think about the relationship you may have with the paternal figure in your life. It could be, say, your father, the way you were brought up, the way things were unfolded in your home environment. Do you have a good relationship with your father? So if you don't, if you had some conflicts, that may, drag throughout life, and you may have exactly that, unresolved issues, perhaps unresolved issues with the relationship that you had with your father and the way that affected or not your relationship and the way you relate with the world. So that could very much be present in the counseling environment. So if we are not aware of those things when we are counseling someone, we may inadvertently bring all these unresolved issues, our own feelings, into the counseling session. And then the counseling session may well become more about us and our own feelings rather than the client's feelings. So that is why we need to be really aware of that. I'm not saying we need to resolve all of our issues before starting to become a counselor. That will be a little bit too idealistic. But at least being aware of that and being able to bracket them, put them in a drawer and not bring them to the session, because it would be unethical to do so. And the same thing with our anxieties. It is natural to feel a little bit of anxiety when we're doing something new. When we are starting a new role, of course, you haven't done it before, so it does make sense to feel a little bit of anxiety. However, once more, being aware of those anxieties and how those anxieties may play a role in the counseling relationship, it's very, very relevant, because we don't want to be crippled by anxiety. We don't want to bring or project an anxious persona towards our counselor, our client, because if we do so, then the client may not feel safe, may not feel compelled to open up, may not feel that they can fully trust you. So that's something to keep in mind. It's good to have a little bit of anxiety, but being aware of that, observe our own anxieties, and perhaps let it go. Without going too many steps ahead, what I just said aligns with this idea of ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy. It's one of the schools of thoughts or ways of doing therapy, and it's pretty much being able to see something, acknowledge it, and let it go. Almost aligned with mindfulness. So the same thing with our anxiety. We're not saying push it away, the anxiety must disappear, because we haven't got that experience. It's normal to feel anxiety. Because it's normal to feel anxiety, we should acknowledge it and let it go. Now, in terms of being yourself and not becoming overly preoccupied with the process and techniques. That's a really tricky one. This relates to the first video I did for this week when we were talking about this eclectic approach and this postmodernist approach. And that basically was saying, well, yes, it's really good to know about the theoretical approaches, the schools of thoughts, the different techniques that each of these approaches are proposing. Yes. And those techniques will be handy, will be useful in certain contexts, in certain situations. However, not becoming overly preoccupied with the techniques can be quite tricky, can be quite difficult as a beginner, because we may be thinking, well, I've got only 6 sessions, or I've got only X many sessions, and I need to help this person solve a certain issue. So therefore, I need to provide them with certain techniques, clear techniques that they can adhere to and they can implement in order to move along and, I guess, overcome or resolve certain issues. But if we are too preoccupied with the techniques, that can trigger what we call a mechanistic approach. What is mechanistic is, well, think about like a recipe when you're cooking. It's almost like following the steps way too structured, which is not a bad thing, but you can see how the persona, the human connection can be mitigated, and perhaps there's not so much room for the counselor to be themselves and to offer that, again, that human connection, that relatedness, that I am hearing you, I am understanding where you're coming from, rather than, okay, here are the steps, here are the techniques, this is what we need to do in order to address a certain problem. So you can see how that can be a little bit tricky. And again, it's important to be aware of the potential techniques we could implement. However, being mindful that that doesn't overwhelm or that doesn't overtake the counseling process and the human relationship. Be aware of the motivations underpinning any self-disclosures, that's really important, and the effect that this may have on your client. So what is self-disclosure? Basically, talking about yourself. Should we talk about ourselves in sessions as counselors? Some schools of thoughts would say, well, there's room for a little bit of self-disclosure. Some schools of thought would say, no. So, without going too much into the different schools of thoughts, the psychoanalytic perspective would propose that we should be a blank canvas. So, not saying absolutely anything about ourselves. And even if the client is asking personal questions about ourselves, we should deflect those questions deliberately. And the idea is to create, again, this blank canvas for the client to be able to imagine who we are. And in that imagining process, it may be that they project their feelings and they imagine us as a paternal or maternal figure or relevant figure in their lives. So it's what we call transference. Again, we haven't learned about that. That's going to come in the next few weeks. But it's good to start thinking about that. So in terms of self-disclosure, from a psychoanalytic perspective, no self-disclosure. But from a more humanistic perspective or existentialist perspective, there may be a little bit of room for us to engage in a little bit of self-disclosure. Not too much. We don't want to talk about our partners, our families, our own personal situations in terms of providing a lot of details, because that will be unethical. But we may want to provide, for example, an example of something that may capture the issues or the processes that are happening for our client. We may maybe talk about a similar case we had in the past. Of course, always concealing personal details, because otherwise it will be unethical. But you can see how there may be a little bit of room for a little bit of self-disclosure. Now, if we are talking about ourselves a lot and we're revealing a lot of personal details, again, it becomes, I would call it unethical, but it does become problematic, because then the session is about us rather than the client. And if we are taking a little bit of too much protagonism, then the relationship is not so much a relationship of a client and a counselor, but more almost like two friends sharing personal stories, which is not bad. It's probably very, very beneficial for people, but not in the counseling context. That's not what a client comes to see you for. They want to be heard, they want to be listened to, they want to be understood. And yes, there could be a little bit of reflection, again, maybe sharing one or two tiny examples, but again, not too much self-disclosure. And not only being aware of these self-disclosures, but what could be the effect that those self-disclosures have on the client. Are those self-disclosures affecting your ability to maintain a professional relationship, what I was just mentioning? Or are we becoming two friends just sharing a space where I charge the client? So we're not really friends. So you can see how it can become a little bit problematic. The next one is avoiding perfectionism. That's a tricky one. I would say some people have a certain predisposition to be more perfectionist. Some people are a bit more relaxed. And that could be genetics, that could be from a learned environment. It could be that, again, some people are a bit more predisposed to be a certain way or another way. If you are usually someone who is not very perfectionistic and quite relaxed, I would say, cool, that's good. Bring that into the session. But if you are someone who is a little bit more on the perfectionistic side, and that's usually you, that's usually how you go about life, then it's good to be aware of that, and it's good to be reflecting on that, so it doesn't become a problem in terms of how much progress your client can make. Because if we're too perfectionistic, we will try to address and understand absolutely everything that the client brings this session. But that's very unlikely. That's quite idealistic again. Perhaps it's not really possible to address absolutely everything that is happening in a certain time frame. So perfectionism can go against this human quality that we were saying, where we're more spontaneous, we're more genuine, we're more vulnerable with people. So if we are perfectionistic, you can see how it goes against being this idea of a real and genuine human being with flaws, yeah? Dealing with clients who lack commitment. That can be, again, a tricky one, because one of the main things that you would expect in sessions is people who are committed, people who want to see you, people who want to do something different in their lives. And if that's lacking, then you can see how it can become quite problematic. And the main problem or the main issue is as beginner therapists, how do we deal with that lack of commitment? How do we manage someone who is perhaps lacking the motivation or the willingness to come to sessions, to talk to you, or maybe they don't even know why they are coming to sessions? It could be that you're dealing with, I don't know, you're working in a space where you deal with adults and maybe they come from their own volition. Cool, that'll be the ideal case. But it could be that they are legally mandated. Maybe you're working in a space of AOD, alcohol and other drugs. So in terms of addictions. And maybe you can see how if someone is addicted, they may be sent to you, to the counselor, to deal with their addiction. But perhaps they're being told they're addicted or they're an addict, but they don't really think of themselves as having a problem. So you can see how it can be quite problematic in that space. And the client may not have the commitment or willingness to come to sessions, open up. The same thing sometimes happens, like myself, working with children who may be sent there by the well-being team at the school, sometimes by their parents. And one of the things that I tend to ask kids in either the first session or the few sessions is, what is counseling? Why do you think you're seeing me? What are we trying to do in this space? So at least they gain this insight and understanding of what are the things we can do, what are the things they can bring into counseling, and whether they want to be there or not. Because people shouldn't be really forced, unless they're legally mandated, people shouldn't be really forced to come to sessions if they lack that commitment. So again, you can see how lacking commitment can be quite challenging as a beginner therapist. Tolerating ambiguity. What does that mean? So ambiguity is the idea that things are not clear, things are not sometimes transparent, sometimes straightforward, sometimes there's fluctuation. Sometimes the clients will be okay with certain things, sometimes they will not. Sometimes they will be okay with the techniques you propose or the homework you propose to them, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they will have lack of commitment, sometimes they will be really committed. So this idea of ambiguity and, again, fluctuation of feelings, commitments, disclosures, a range of things, being able to deal with that, once more acceptance, commitment therapy, observe that ambiguity and let it go. And acknowledge that it's part of the counseling process. Developing your own counseling style. Again, this is difficult to do. Why is that? Because I think developing your own counseling style comes from several factors. One factor is knowing which counseling styles are available. Again, in the first video, I did a very quick, very brief history of counseling where I mentioned just a few different counseling styles, but we haven't really explored that too much. We will do that in a few weeks, but again, in this unit, not a lot. So perhaps knowing which counseling styles are available takes a little bit of research, takes a little bit of professional development, takes a little bit of a bit of time to get there, to know what are the options. And then you need to know about yourself. So what are these options and how do they match my personality, my way of seeing the world, my way of interacting with people? Am I more pragmatic, down to the point, very practical, and trying to address the issues very quickly? So am I more like CBT approach, cognitive behavioral approach, where I see a problem and I try to address it, I give the client homework and try to move on? Or am I more aligned with perhaps exploring someone's early childhood memories and issues that may bring throughout their lives or for a long time, and that can be very deeply seated with them? So maybe I'm more a psychoanalytic oriented counselor. Maybe that resonates a little bit more with me. But you can see how to identify yourself as a psychoanalytic perspective or psychoanalytic counselor. Maybe it is needed to read a little bit of Freud, a little bit of Lacan, or Melanie Klein, or other psychoanalysts. So again, it takes a little bit of groundwork to know what is available, a little bit of introspection to know who you are and how you align with those techniques or with those perspectives, but also the different clients and different presentations, because I may be very psychoanalytically oriented, but that requires a lot of introspection, people being able to reflect on what is happening for them, and perhaps a level of cognitive development. Whereas in my work with kids, say 6-year-old, that level of development may not be there, the cognitive development, the language to translate, put the thoughts into words may not be there. So the expectation of working from a psychoanalytical perspective with a 6-year-old may be somewhat challenging. Becoming aware of your own counter-transference. Once more, we're jumping ahead here. This is a psychoanalytic concept. The idea of transference is what I mentioned before in terms of being aware of how the client's feelings can be projected towards the counselor, the therapist, but the counter effect could also be present. So counter transference, your own feelings, your own shortcomings, your own limitations, and how you relate to the world, perhaps through your own unresolved issues, and how that affects the relationship with your client in the counseling context, in the counseling space. I'll give you an example. So, in terms of developing connections, I remember I was I'm not a father, so I don't have kids. It's not that I can't, simply that hasn't happened to me in my life yet. But I wish I could. I wish I had that fatherly feeling and being able to be a fatherly figure for someone. Because that's not in my life, that's not part of who I am so far. I may be longing for that experience. And I remember, again, I mentioned I work with kids. I remember there was one client I started seeing who lost his father. His father passed away. And that was the main referral, or that was the main reason why I was seeing this child. So you can see how the child started developing feelings in terms of projecting his longingness for having a father, and that was being projected towards me in the counseling space. And the counter transference in that case would be me being, reciprocating that needing or longingness for having a fatherly figure, and perhaps I was almost fulfilling that fatherly figure. So you can see how there's this idea of transference and counter transference. Transference from the client to the therapist, counter transference from the therapist to the client. Of course, I remember in supervision, I disclosed this sensation I had, and I was wondering, I was going through this reflective and introspective process where I was wondering whether there was room for counter transference and whether I was feeling a little bit apprehensive, and perhaps I was projecting my own either curiosity or maybe even the need to experience what would be being a father. So you can see how, if that was the case, and that's what was happening for me, the counseling space can become a little bit tainted, a little bit confused, and perhaps less than ideal. Another important one that we've got as beginner therapists is this idea of declining to give advice or take responsibility for clients' lives. So declining to give advice can be really tricky. Why is that? Because it may well be that you have a client directly asking you for advice, that they come to sessions and they say, hey, this is my problem, what can I do? They actually pose it as a question. And naturally, we people will be almost compelled to answer that question, even more if we feel that we've got the tools to be able to provide that answer. But the thing is, we already mentioned this, we're not advisors. Counselors do not answer questions for the clients, but we may be able to answer questions with the clients, simply allowing them to explore, to bring their own issues, and perhaps through their own reflective process, being able to see what a certain question looks like, how does that affect their lives, and what are the possibilities that they see, rather than us providing solutions for their answers, for the questions. Here's another interesting one. Understanding and accepting silence. That can be really challenging. I am aware that many times I have deliberately filled spaces, filled silence, because you may think, well, this is uncomfortable, and perhaps the dynamic or the dynamism of the space is beginning to dissipate, and I need to fill that void, fill that gap with my own thoughts. But you can see how all of the things that I've been mentioning, if we're projecting our own thoughts, it's a little bit tricky. So understanding silence, it took me a while to understand that sometimes silence was not something uncomfortable and not something that should be avoided. In fact, many times, again, it took me a while to realize this, but many times I was feeling that silence because of my own anxiety and inexperience. And it turned out that clients were actually taking that time to process what was happening for them. And different people may have different response times. Maybe I engage in this introspective process where it takes me 30 seconds or maybe even a minute to blurt an answer or project my thoughts. And if the counselor is a little bit anxious, they may start talking to fill that gap while I am going through this, process of thinking what is happening for me. The other thing that it could happen is some neurodivergent presentations, for example, ASD, autism spectrum disorder. Some kids that I've been seeing, I've realized again after a while that for them it just simply takes a longer time to answer or to engage in conversation. Sometimes I'll be saying a simple thing like, "How was your weekend?" or "How was your week?" And one child that I can think of will be posing their eyes or staring blankly at the empty space in the room, thinking, and then actually respond. So you can see how for that person it takes a bit longer to produce that answer. And again, if we are uncomfortable with that silence, we may be losing the chance to do something really cool in the counseling space. Recognizing and being honest about our limitations while acknowledging our strengths. I think acknowledging our strengths is a little bit easier than recognizing our limitations, but both of these are quite challenging, quite difficult. Our own limitations can be really tricky because we may think that if we expose our limitations, we are exposing that we are in fact inexperienced, and that this idea of imposter syndrome may come back to the forefront, and we may be thinking we don't want to tell everyone that we haven't dealt with a certain presentation. I'll give you an example. Again, in the school, one child was once referred to me for selective mutism. So the idea of selective mutism is someone who is not incapable of talking, but simply not talking in certain contexts. In the school context, this child was not talking at all, but I heard her talking to her mum. Sometimes her mum will come and pick her up after school. So this child clearly had the ability to talk. So that's usually related to anxiety. Sometimes it's a consequence of traumatic events. But the reality is I saw this child for a couple of sessions and I couldn't get a single word out of her. And you can see how that was a bit frustrating for me. And perhaps it was playing on this idea of, well, maybe it's my own lack of expertise, maybe it's my own inability to be an effective counselor. But the reality is that selective mutism is a complex presentation and it requires specialized training. I didn't have that training. So the right and ethical thing for me to do was to approach the well-being team, the child and the parent and say, perhaps it will be better if this child saw someone who is specialized in this particular presentation, which was selective mutism. So again, outlining or I guess venting your own limitations, it's not a bad thing to do. Learning to use techniques appropriately. This is a big one because sometimes we learn a couple of techniques and we think, okay, this is a one size fit all and I want to apply this technique to everyone. But the reality is that that's not the case. The reality is that we are all different, and different techniques are appropriate for different situations. I'll give you another example. There was one child who was undiagnosed with neurodivergent presentations, and sometimes the child was a little bit reluctant to discuss certain things. So one thing I did is I looked up a video where they were explaining what meltdowns were. So meltdowns is where someone becomes dysregulated and has a little bit of difficulty understanding what is happening for them and being able to regulate those emotions. Sometimes that stems from frustration. For this child, it was stemming from the idea of feeling wronged, that other people will do something deliberately to this child, where in fact that was not the case. So the child was thinking, oh, that person is doing that to me on purpose, and was becoming so frustrated by that fact that will become dysregulated and perhaps become really angry, wouldn't necessarily fight with other people, but it was more around perhaps crying and being unable to communicate what was happening for them, which was quite challenging. So what I did is I showed this child a video of what meltdowns were, and that generated a space of awareness for this child, thinking, okay, I'm not the only one that goes through this. This is the name for what is happening to me, meltdowns. In fact, there are usually two different ways of seeing meltdowns and shutdowns, where meltdowns is someone exploding and shutdown is being withdrawn, and he was experiencing both. So it was actually really useful for this child to know a little bit more about, again, what it looked like and what could be done. What were the consequences of feeling, or I guess experiencing those feelings in those situations. And then I tried to implement the same approach with another client. But this client completely withdrew because was not prepared to be exposed to that situation, to that content. And I quickly learned that that was not the right approach for this client. For this client particularly, I realized that what we call play therapy was a much better approach, which was pretty much taking a step back, metaphorically, and allowing the child to use the space as he saw fit. Because this child was really creative and had a lot of initiative and had a lot of need to move around the room and explore what was happening. And that usually brings about this idea of translating their own thought process into verbalizations that perhaps may be telling, maybe revealing of what is happening for them. And I took this idea from 𝓃𝒶𝑜'𝓈. There's a book called 𝓃𝒶𝑜'𝓈, which I read not too long ago. And she uses this idea of play therapy. And if you go through that book, you'll see that throughout the sessions, she doesn't really do much more than just reflecting, simply reflecting what the child, 𝓃𝒶, was doing in sessions. And I thought, well, perhaps I need to borrow that, and actually it was really effective. For this child, from being withdrawn to feeling in control of the session to feeling heard, respected, was a really big difference, and actually a lot of issues emerged because of that approach, because of that technique. Another really key one is maintaining your vitality and energy as a person and practitioner. This is, I would say, the key consideration to have when we are beginner practitioners. Why is that? For two reasons. The first reason is propriety. You may recall in weeks 3 and 4 we talked about ethics, and we were saying that one of the principles within the APS Code of Ethics was propriety, which is being able to know when you are not perhaps enjoying your full capacities, and that very may well be due to stress. Again, this profession, psychology or counseling, can be quite stressful, plus any other demands that we may have in life. So if we are not acknowledging this stress, not acknowledging how the stress we may be exposed to may be affecting our ability to fully function at the best of our capacities within the counseling space, it can be a little bit unethical. But also, the idea of being aware of our own stress and anxieties and whatever is happening for us, in order to be able to implement some strategies to mitigate that. Again, it's not unlikely that as a beginner counselor, we may experience more stress than we would later down the track when we actually, I don't know, say 3, 4, 5 years down the track. We've been practicing for, 5 years. And then it's likely that you are a little bit more relaxed during the sessions, before the sessions, after the sessions, because you've got the experience, you've got that knowledge with you. Whereas when you are a beginner, it's likely that you will be more stressed. So not acknowledging that stress and not respecting yourself as a person can be quite challenging. And if you do acknowledge that stress, then you are able to do something about it. In my case, to deal with stress, I would say the physical space and physical activity and movement was quite useful. In my case, again, in terms of sports, for example, running, playing tennis, swimming, whatever it is that you feel comfortable with or what you like. But that can have a really direct impact on your physiological response to stress. And that in, say, a couple of weeks or a month or a longer period of time will necessarily affect your mental well-being, your mental health. And it would be a little bit, ludicrous to think about us counseling someone about their own mental health issues and us not taking care of our own mental health issues. And the reality is that everyone goes through things. For some people, these things can be a bit more extreme, and we may experience certain presentations along with certain diagnoses, major depression, generalized anxiety. For some people, that may be just a little bit of stress. But most people will go through something at some point in their lives. So again, us as counselors, we need to be sincere, we need to be able to acknowledge, recognize, take action about our own issues first. So there are many other issues that may be faced by beginner practitioners, but I wanted to take you through what I thought would be some of the most salient or most important or relevant issues. If you know about any other issues that you may have faced, either because you were either a practitioner or a client, or you know someone who is in this space and has struggled with something like that, and you want to share that with us, feel free to do so. And perhaps that can be also brought to the tutorial sessions, where you could think about some of the issues that you may want to be addressing, preemptively addressing, that perhaps you may experience as a beginner counselor. So I hope this video was useful. Again, I just wanted to disrupt a little bit of what we were doing, just to do something a little bit more different, hopefully more fun. There will be another video this week where I will talk about the role of technology, and for that we'll go back to the other format of slides and videos and me talking in the background. So I'll see you in the next video. I hope you enjoyed the content here, and I hope you find it useful.